Hi there, this is Mark Kilborn with Pro Sound Effects. Today we're going to take a look at creating gun sounds for first-person shooter video games. This is my weapon template. So this is similar to the session I use for sound design in general, but I have a few things that I do a little differently for weapons. First and foremost, I break apart the content I'm going to build into 5 folder tracks, which I do for rendering purposes, and I'll show you that at the end. I have them broken up into the 5 layers that I usually use to implement these in a game engine. So there's the transient layer, the body, the sub, the mech, and the tail layer. Within each one of these, if you expand it, you'll see the content that I've placed in here and edited, moved around, etc. Let's actually start not from the top, we'll start from the body. And I want to show what I did there. So I picked 3 mics that I like to signal from out of the King Collections Pro library, which is what I used for almost everything in here. The only exception is a subharmonic synthesis / sampler plugin, which I'll get to in a minute. But this is the body layer. So there was that. There's that piece and that. So I've got these 3 layers in here. And this first one, I just EQ'd a little bit. The second one, I pushed the EQ a bit. I did a bit of spread, and I added some saturation using Black Box HG2, which I'm a big fan of. This third layer, I removed a lot of the high end via EQ. And then I pushed it really, really hard through a transient designer to try to sharpen it up a little bit. So that's the layer together. The transient layer, I found 2 sounds that I particularly liked for this. One was this kind of click layer. And the next one was this guy, which is a wider thing, still fairly sharp. So in processing, one of the first things I did was I used a plugin I like called K-Clip. And what I do with this is I push things into it. And if I play this back and forth, A/B it for you, you'll kind of hear what this plugin does. It makes things loud, obviously. And it's kind of like compression, but what it's actually doing is it's simulating clipping without actually clipping your master bus. And sometimes, this is kind of a dark secret of sound design, maybe, I don't know. But sometimes clipping actually sounds good. I have worked with recording sessions that were custom made for projects I was on, for example. And often the guns that were recorded were intentionally clipped while being recorded because the recordist who ran the session was specifically after that sound. And it's also equally useful to do this, in the process of designing a gun. So it's very common that I will use a clipping plugin of some sort to try to change the sound of something and not just make it louder, but also kind of change the character of it, as you can hear there. Then I used a transient designer, and if I A/B that, it's subtle, but it's sharpening up that transient just a little more, right? Then the second layer, I'm basically doing the same exact thing. In fact, I may have even the settings are slightly different. I was going to say I may have even just copied the plugins. I probably did and then tweaked them from there. But again, you can hear this before. And then with the clipper, and then with the transient designer, you hear how it gets a lot sharper. And then if I play the whole thing together, so that's with the processing, that's without, that's with. And then if you see this K-clip here, this one's actually not really doing anything other than providing a ceiling. And the reason I do that is sometimes when I'm working with really, really loud sounds, I find that the limiter, because a limiter is just a heavy brick wall compressor, it can really have a negative impact on the sound. It can soften transients or soften a little bit of the range. So if you listen to this without it, and then with it, you hear how it gets a little bit sharper when that clipper's turned on. If you clip it before you go into a limiter, you can preserve some of that sharpness, and the limiter won't squash as much of that from your sound, which is nice. So the next section is a sublayer. So the sublayer is something that I use on just about every gun I build, but what I do with it changes a little bit depending on the context or depending on the type of weapon I'm building. Sometimes I will build LFE exclusive content in this section that will then get routed to the LFE channel when I'm building the gun in the game engine. Sometimes, like in this case, I will use this simply as a way to build a little more low-end kind of heft to the gun. In this particular case, I'm using a kick drum, which is I think the only sound in this project that did not come out of the King Guns collection. I'm using a kick drum, and it is a LM1 kick drum, actually. I've got a collection of kick drums from Musical Adventures over the years, and I've found that drums really just kind of round out a gun really well. A friend of mine who taught me how to make guns long ago pointed this out, and I've been doing it ever since. So on top of the kick drum, I've got an instance of Enforcer, which is adding another layer of kind of low frequency stuff to it. I've got a Transient Designer on it, and this is, again, just kind of sharpening it up. And then I've added some R-bass just to give me a little bit of that higher low frequency that cuts through a little bit better on speakers and like laptops and other things. There are different types of bass enhancers, and some of them do different things. One of the things that's useful about R-bass is it, instead of focusing on like super low frequency stuff that you're only going to hear on a really high-end consumer system or on a pro studio system, this allows you to create frequencies that are a little above that lower threshold, like, above 60 hertz. In fact, in this case, where are we? So in this case, we're creating additional frequencies at 80, additional content at 80 hertz. So it's a little bit higher, and it just kind of makes things feel a little meatier, right? So the mech layer is important on a gun. You can communicate to the player a number of things about the weapon they're firing. You can communicate how nice is the gun versus how old and rattly is it. You can convey if it's really cheap by using a lot of more plasticky sounding elements, if it's really expensive by using more metal sounding elements. It's kind of a subjective thing, but these are some of the choices you can make. The busier and rattlier this is, you can make a gun feel like it's kind of fallen apart or barely functional. By keeping your content really tight in here, you can make it feel like a really refined, well-engineered piece of machinery. For this case, I took a handful of sounds here. I'm going to mute some of these because most of my processing is on the bus here. But I found a handful of sounds that I liked for this. The first one was actually from an AK-47. There's a bunch of AK-47 recordings in the Guns library. But I used that, and I'm actually going to turn this up. There we go. But I used that because that gives me kind of an authentic piece. Then I wanted to add some more metal to it to make it just a tiny bit busier and give it a little more of a metallic feel. So I found this Colt 911 pistol mechanism. And then I found this dry fire. And if you look at the placement of this dry fire relative to the rest of the sounds, you can see that it's kind of happening right just barely before the transient of the shot fires. And I do that on purpose because that's a good way to kind of sneak a little bit of the mech in before the shot actually fires, and it can make the gun feel a little bit bigger. And actually, I should have covered this in the transient section, but if you look at where I've put the transient here, relative to the body of the shot, you'll see that I've actually got a tiny little bit of time here. This time, though it's really, really small, makes a world of difference in how these weapons can sound. So let me jump back up here for a second and play with this a little bit just to demonstrate what you can do with this. So that is the sound of the body and the transient together. If I shift this forward, it sounds like that. If I shift it back that way, it sounds like that. If I pull it even further forward, you hear how that separation's kind of creating an impression of it being larger or smaller? And you obviously can go too far, and it can start to feel crazy. But controlling this distance between the transient and the start of the shot can give you a lot of power. And again, when you throw the mech layer into this, that'll let you sneak a little more metal into it. So the mech together sounds like this, which doesn't sound particularly exciting on its own. But when you add a clipper, of course, it's clearly my favorite thing to do on guns right now. And when you add a little bit of EQ, so I'm pulling a little of the low end out, and I'm pulling a little bit of something out at 300 that my ear didn't like. And I put a bit of soothe on it just to kind of tame resonant frequencies a little bit. You end up with this, and it sounds pretty loud. And when I was playing it in the context of the rest of the weapon, I felt like it was just a little too much. So when we play the whole gun at the end, we'll play that with everything, and I'll crank it up, and then I'll turn it back down and show kind of where it's sat in the end. So then there's the tail layer. There's a number of ways to approach tails. In this case, I picked one out that I liked from the library, and I processed it a little bit. I pulled a little bit of the center frequencies out of it using a mid-side tool called Center from Waves. Anything that you've got that'll do mid-side editing will work for that. There's something built into Reaper that most DAWs have a tool for it. I applied a bit of EQ, pulled off some low end, pulled out a little crud, pushed up 2900 a little bit to make it feel a little more exciting. And that was really it. And then I edited the front of it and kind of faded this in a little bit just to give the body of the shot some room to breathe before the tail hits. Now, tails are a tricky thing in games. Tails are useful for communicating to the player the distance of a weapon when it's being fired by an NPC. They're also very useful for communicating to the player where they are. So I've built one single tail for this example. But when I'm building a first-person shooter gun, I will often build several tails, and I will swap them based on the context the player is in. So we will look at, if the player is inside of a building, inside of a really reflective room, we might have a tail that matches up with that. If the player's outside, we'll have a tail that matches up with that, which this sounds like a very outside kind of tail. If the weapon is being fired by an NPC who's at a further distance away, we'll have several versions of tails that kind of swap in based on the distance. And so the close ones will go away and the more distant ones will play. So tails are a big topic. I could probably do a whole video on the subject of gun tails, and maybe I'll get to do that. That would be fun. But for today's example, I just took a recording I liked. I kind of polished it up a little bit and turned it into a tail. And so now I'm going to play you the whole thing and let you hear how it came together. So here is the entire weapon. Here we go. So I'm going to play with a couple things quickly just to demonstrate. So first of all, the mech. You notice all these buses are at 0. I pulled the mech down by -9. When I first finished this, the mech was just too much. I wanted it to go down, and I could turn this down in the engine, but I generally try to print sounds around the level that I'm going to want to use them in the engine. So for this, I just turned it down by 9 dB, and that is about where it felt right. Now, the other thing that I've done, and I'm probably going to do it here too, is I've got these K-clip instances on a lot of these tracks just to help prevent the limiter from squishing stuff too much. So even adding that to the sub makes it feel just a little bit heavier, doesn't it? So this is it. I mean, what I would do from here is I would take additional takes for each of these, recordings I pulled in from the library. I've got additional takes. So I would down the timeline build 4 or 5 more variations. Then I would start bouncing these out using the region render matrix, which is a feature in Reaper that allows me to render each chunk, each layer of the sound, pulling from each one of these buses or each one of these folder tracks as its render point. So I would go through and, have set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4, set 5, render all these out. And then if I decided once I got it in the game engine, I needed to come back and make some tweaks, I'd come back, make some tweaks, select all these, render them out again. But this is kind of my approach. This one was thrown together pretty quickly. I would normally spend more time on this. I'm a big believer that you don't really know how things sound until they're in the engine and you can play with them in context. As this is a demo for you all, I don't have a game to put it in to play with and listen to this in context with. So I just kind of quickly threw this together, but I would normally play this in a game engine, walk away from it for a day, listen to it again the next day, play with it in game, make some notes, come back and tweak and iterate. This is a fairly solid first pass, but this is kind of what goes into this. It's, this mystified me when I was early in my career trying to figure out how to make these guns sound big and dramatic, like in a first-person shooter, like some of the games I love, like Battlefield. But what I found was that a lot of it is not about tons and tons of processing. It's about finding good recordings and just making small little moves that kind of help the thing incrementally sound better. And before long, you take a pile of WAV files from your library and you turn them into this. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, and leave us a comment below and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next.